Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Animal Care Wednesday webinar. My name is Amy Schleicher, and I'm filling in for Heidi Carroll as your host this morning. I'm a regional livestock specialist with University of Missouri Extension. If you're not familiar with it, the Animal Care Wednesday webinar is a collaboration of several states' extension services, including Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, University of Missouri Extension, Nebraska Extension, and South Dakota State University Extension. Before we get started with our program this morning, I wanted to go over just a few details with you in case you haven't attended before. Again, if you could please mute your microphones or your phones, that would be great with the sound quality. So we won't be taking questions via audio, but we will be taking those via the chat box. So if you could type those in as we go along, that would be great. And we'll either get to those during or at the end of the presentation. I will tell you that this session will be recorded for later viewing, and you're welcome to go back and view this or other recordings, other past recordings, at the web link that I listed in the chat box, or it's also in the emails that you get from Heidi regarding the webinar. So you're welcome to go to that website. There's also other animal care resources there that you can access. And then at the very end, don't be surprised, I will be launching a brief survey. We'd love to have your feedback. So if you don't mind filling that out, it just take a second. So again, we'd love to get your input on the program. So I think that's all the housekeeping stuff, if you will. So I don't know about you guys, but it felt like we went from winter to summer here. And this hot weather makes me think of what we typically see in July and August at our county fairs. And I know those are right around the corner for us all. And you all have varying roles at your county fairs, but I know one of your roles typically is in that educational and advisory role. And there's lots of animal care issues that we want to make sure are covered as we go through our county fairs. And some of those include things like biosecurity and heat stress. And so we're super happy to have as our speaker this morning, Dr. Vander Ley. He's a veterinary epidemiologist with the Great Plains Veterinary Educational Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. And he's going to be talking about some of those animal health issues like biosecurity and heat stress from the perspective of the show organizer. And so I know we'll get some great information from him as we go into this county fair season. So with that, it is all yours, Dr. Vander Ley.
I got to work on unmuting myself. Can you hear me all right?
Sounds great.
All right. Give me 1 second to get the PowerPoint going. Just as a little bit of background, livestock exhibitions are not outside my experience at all. I've had the pleasure of working at the Iowa State Fair, several county fairs in Iowa while I was working or getting my graduate degree and when I went to vet school. So there's had some experience there, and then I actually worked in Missouri for 4.5 years, and it was in Missouri that I had the pleasure of working at the Missouri State Fair for a couple of years, and then also University of Missouri did some work with the American Royal, so I've been one of the show vets at the American Royal a couple of times. So there's a few things that I've gleaned along the way working with county, state, and then some of these bigger regional livestock shows, and I'd be happy to take any questions. As Amy said, sounds like we're going to use the chat box today. But what I want to talk about is how we try to avoid disease, and I'm defining that as not only infectious disease, but also heat stress related disease, along with things like injuries and stuff like that. For the most part, I'm going to focus on infectious disease and injuries, but if you have questions related to some of the other topics or things that I don't cover, please feel free to let me know. I've included my contact information at the back of this presentation, so you're welcome to email me or call me whenever you'd like. So with that, we get started. I think the first thing is to kind of define the goals. I am personally invested in having healthy animals and people at livestock shows. The photo of my son shown at our county fair last summer. We're hoping to do this again this summer. What we really want is to have healthy people and healthy animals show up for a livestock exhibition. And we want to send those folks and animals home in the same condition that we had them arrive in. So we want to pay careful attention to several details. We want to have some plans in place going into a show. We want to execute those plans while the show is going on, and then have some additional plans ready for the unforeseen. Unfortunately, those are not exciting plans to produce, but there's certain things that happen once in a while that we have to be prepared for, and we'll touch on that a little bit today. So there's several health threats, and these actually they can apply to both humans and livestock. But the threats to livestock specifically that we're gonna try to mitigate with the stuff I'm going to talk about today is we're going to focus on some infectious disease stuff. Infectious disease are the things that are really alarming for veterinarians that work with livestock exhibitions. Essentially, this is kind of a worst case scenario for spreading disease. We take animals from a great variety of places and we bring them all into one place and let them interact and commingle. We bring a lot of people that interact with those same animals in that same environment, and then at the end of it, those same people and animals spread out all over they go back to the places they came, or they go to other shows or fairs. And in terms of disease transmission, that is the worst case scenario. We have this mixing pot followed by a dispersion into a greater geographical area. And if we had some sort of a disease that came in, it would be able to propagate and spread quickly in that environment, and then it would spread much wider geographically before it could be controlled. So we want to be thinking about that, and it can be personally really damaging to the exhibitors if their animals get sick, or there's some diseases that BVD, for instance, if you bring bred animals, bred cattle especially, to a fair, you can actually take home a problem that will have a very significant herd impact. And we want to avoid those things. And there's things at the show level that you can certainly do to enhance your ability to do that. Heat stress during county fair and state fair season is always a big issue. It tends to be the warmest part of the year. Some of the things that people do to increase their chances of being successful at a show event predispose livestock to heat stress. And we want to certainly be aware of what heat stress looks like, and then have a plan in place to mitigate that beyond just what typical exhibitors do with fans and misters and stuff like that. And then there's always physical injuries. I've been involved in a number of situations where the animals or people were injured because of fair facilities, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today. It's something always to think about, have a plan in place for what you do with animals or people that get injured at a fair. But like I said, we're not going to spend as much time on that today. So biggest thing we're going to talk about today is infectious disease risk management. What I want you to think about in terms of risk management for infectious disease is how bugs get transferred from one animal to the next, so how the pathogens move. So there's essentially 5 routes of transmission, and a lot of this information comes from Iowa State Center for Food Security and Public Health. Any of you are from Iowa State, you've probably seen this. If you are not from Iowa State, I would highly recommend that you go to their website. They have a lot of information about diseases and biosecurity, but they boil routes of transmission down to these 5 main pathways. So you have direct contact, so essentially animals touching animals to spread disease. Fomites are things that get used on animals, so these can be like grooming tools or water buckets or water tanks or manure removal equipment, things like that come into contact with pathogens from one animal and then are brought into contact with another animal, and then you can transfer the pathogen via that object or item. Aerosol transmission, there's what we consider large and small droplets. So large droplet is basically a sneeze or a cough. You can think of that. It's shooting these big droplets for a very short distance, typically less than 10 feet. Small droplet or true aerosolized pathogens tend to spread very far on wind. So The most important pathogens that we think about in terms of long distance aerosol transmission are going to be things like PRRS. And then the worst one would be foot and mouth disease, which spread miles and miles on wind. Oral, or I often think of this as fecal oral, typically things that spread via oral transmission or shed via the feces, and then they're reinfected or infected via fecal oral transmission. And then vectors, so these will be your insects, spiders, ticks, flies, things like that. Those are your major routes of transmission. And the reason I present this information is because instead of thinking about each of the individual diseases, it's much simpler to think about how do I break these transmission routes? How do I interrupt direct contact? How do I interrupt fomite transmission? How might I interrupt aerosol transmission? What can I do to prevent fecal oral transmission? And how do I control vectors to make sure that they're not a role or a factor in disease transmission in the context of a livestock exhibition? So disease prevention, I think, is all about the most important thing is to have a plan before the show starts. I'm going to start with the last point first. I would highly consider retaining a veterinarian for a show. There's a lot of veterinarians that will do this for as kind of a public service. It may require paying a veterinarian for this, but this is kind of what veterinarians are trained to do. It's not kind of, it's exactly what veterinarians are trained to do, especially a veterinarian that works with livestock health. Small animal veterinarians do some of this type of thing too, but livestock veterinarians are especially well equipped to think about biosecurity and biological risk management. So the things that the plan needs to encompass, and I think a veterinarian is very good at helping develop these types of items, is you need a lot of exhibitor education. So they need to understand things about animal health and biosecurity. Some of the things that I noticed at the county fairs that I've been to, and even at the bigger shows, is that exhibitors it's a very friendly event, a lot of interaction between kids. They like to help, they like to share, and sometimes that really positive interaction is a very negative thing for their animals. I see a lot of sharing of water buckets, or somebody forgot a piece of equipment, so they just quickly will borrow one from one of their fellow exhibitors. Those types of activities, while they're very positive in terms of teaching kids to be good citizens, are pretty negative things in terms of spreading disease and potentially compromising animal health. So I think educating exhibitors on things like routes of transmission, how they can successfully and safely share equipment or supplies is a positive thing. It's also really important that they understand what's expected of them in terms of the entry requirements. I'm kind of skipping around on my list here. So I think it's really important for a fair to have entry requirements that are published and established. I've been part of fairs that require certificates of veterinary inspection. These are the health papers. I hate the name health paper because a visual inspection is not an incredibly sensitive way to detect a sick animal. However, it's good to have some sort of an assurance that a veterinarian has looked at the animals and said, at this point in time, we see no visual signs of illness. I am also a huge fan of arrival inspections at exhibition events. Many fairs and shows will do a sheep and goat inspection, looking for fungus and sore mouth and things like that. Those are very important because those are zoonotic diseases. But I think there's value in inspecting pigs and cattle and chickens and all the other stuff too, to make sure that there's no obvious signs of disease. The best way to keep disease from spreading at a show is to make sure that it never gets in. So part of this plan is to identify likely routes of transmission and try to interrupt those with plans. So having a really solid plan for how waste, manure, and bedding gets managed is important, making sure that we can interrupt those fecal oral transmission routes, making sure that there's good vector control at the fairgrounds or the show site, wherever it is. Fly control and other external parasites are important vectors, and we can definitely manage those with some chemical treatments before the show starts to mitigate that impact. I also think it's important to identify if any particular diseases that should be tested for. A good example is the Denver Stock Show a number of years ago implemented DVD testing for cattle. Things like that can be a really positive way to keep diseases out and make sure that the animals coming in are as healthy as possible. Another part of this that goes into the exhibitor education is that human health plays a role in these types of discussions as well. A lot of these shows have swine at them. A lot of them have poultry. There's a number of diseases, flu being the most important one that spreads easily between swine, poultry, and humans. And if you have an individual that has the flu coming into a livestock show, it would be much better if they stayed home, because that is actually transmissible to the livestock. For those of you who remember back a couple of years, the swine flu that made such a big ripple in the livestock industry a number of years ago was actually transmitted from a human in Mexico to a swine herd, and that started the swine flu pandemic that we all got to hear a lot about in the news. So it's important that healthy people show up as well. It's a lot harder to regulate that, but education is a big part of that. The next part of this, once you have a good plan that you've thought out well and developed with some expert guidance from a veterinarian or potentially some other good resources, is you got to execute that plan. As I said before, I'm a huge fan of checking livestock in. I think that should happen before they get stalled. Once in a while, I get into situations where I'm doing check-ins where I'm going to where the animals have been housed. It's much more difficult in terms of being thorough to make sure that all the animals get looked at if they get stalled before check-in happens. So I like doing this off the trailer or in a really well controlled environment before the animals have a chance to be exposed to the environment where they're going to hang out for a number of days potentially for a show. I really strongly encourage scheduled inspections to monitor health throughout an exhibition, so making sure there's some walkthroughs happening. This is really well done by a veterinarian. Doesn't necessarily have to be a vet. Other people can walk through and check animals too. It's important that this happens at the right time of the day. So I like to walk through fairs early in the morning or late at night. Just walk through the barns and listen for coughing, look for animals that don't appear as normal as they should be, and then look at those animals a bit further. I think there's two important plans that are sort of sub-plans of the first stuff. One of them is an isolation plan. So what if an animal does get sick at the fair? What are we going to do with it? We're going to send it home. We're going to isolate that thing on the fairgrounds. What are we going to do about treatments? Who's going to provide those treatments? We're going to let owners do that stuff. That can get a little dicey in certain venues. We're going to have a veterinarian come. If so, where's the veterinarian going to come from? Those sorts of things are important things to consider when you get sick animals at a show. The other thing that I think bears some discussion in terms of fair board or a show event planning committee is what happens if there is some sort of a disease outbreak at the show. Thankfully, this is often an outside chance, but it is not impossible. I've been part of a couple of shows where we had potential outbreaks on our hands. There was one county fair I was involved in where I was pretty sure we were going to have an outbreak of acute pleural pneumonia in pigs, which would have been devastating. Thankfully, it did not turn out that way. But going into that show, we did not have a plan to isolate those pigs and actually even be able to treat them appropriately, because that was a terminal show and they were going to slaughter. So you got to have a plan for what happens if we have to treat a bunch of animals because of a disease outbreak, which would create violative residues, and now we can't send them to slaughter anymore. How is that going to play out? So there's a couple plans. Those are sort of worst case scenario plans, but plan for the worst, hope for the best, and hopefully you end up getting what you hope for and not what you've planned for. Heat stress is a big deal at county fairs during the summer. There's a couple things about animals that make them very different than people in terms of heat stress. Although I was telling Amy before, I think we should talk about heat stress in people because it makes them grumpy, and they tend to get hard to work with. They're hot and grumpy as well. But in animals, so people sweat to cool. So we produce sweat that evaporates, and that evaporative cooling cools our skin and allows us to thermal regulate when things get hot. Cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, and rabbits, I believe, all the major species we're dealing with, except for horses, do not sweat primarily as a cooling mechanism. Most of these animals actually cool themselves using the same mechanism, but they cool themselves via evaporative cooling of fluid from the lungs and the airways. So they're actually getting rid of water via their lungs and trachea and nasal passages, and that evaporative cooling allows them to cool their bodies. So they're often, these animals usually have a lot of hair. By the time they get to the fair, they also have a lot of fat cover, which makes them a little bit less able to dissipate heat. Actually, in many cases, a lot less able to dissipate heat. And some of the things exhibitors do, for instance, coolers and fans and daily cold water baths and stuff like that, really promote hair growth, which really impede heat dissipation from these animals. And that really sets an animal up for heat stress, particularly if they go from a 50-degree cooler on one day to a 100-degree fair the next day. The other thing to bear in mind is that heat stress is not so much a product of temperature, it is a product of temperature and humidity. So the temperature humidity index is really what dictates heat stress. This table you see over on the right-hand side of the screen here is the temperature humidity index. And you can see that there's this red band in the lower right-hand part of that table is pretty severe heat stress for cattle. And even at temperatures as low as 81 degrees with very high humidity, you can have severe heat stress going on already. So you got to be aware of the signs of heat stress. This calf in the picture is at a feedlot. It's open mouth breathing. It'll be panting. They'll often be drooling. Ruminants will drool when they're heat stressed because they're breathing so hard they don't take the time to swallow their saliva, and you'll see a lot of drooling because of that. So you got to educate exhibitors and the people who are in charge of those particular species, the superintendents, to make sure that they understand and know what heat stress is, and then be aware of the kind of conditions. So high temperatures and or high humidity can drive heat stress, and then you got to do something about it. I assume that most exhibitors are going to be using fans and potentially misters at these livestock shows. So to put that in here is kind of stating the obvious, but there's a couple things that I think we can do as organizers, especially, that improve our ability to manage heat stress. One of them is to create some rules in the premium book that say never allow water deprivation. Shrinking is in my opinion, a bit of a questionable practice anyway in terms of animal welfare. But in the case of summer shows where animals are going to be subject to heat stress anyway, shrinking goes from a animal welfare risk to something that is definitively compromising animal welfare, and I don't think it should happen. And there's some ways that you can prevent this. You can make rules, but rules are only as good as the people who read and choose to follow them, or conversely, as the enforcement goes. So weigh-backs at showtime can really help eliminate shrinking. If animals gain too much weight from weigh-in to showtime, you have pretty solid evidence that they shrunk them before weigh-in. And then some common sense stuff. If a show is scheduled for 4 o'clock in the afternoon and it's going to be 80% humidity and 100 degrees, I would seriously consider moving that event to a cooler time of day. Doing things earlier in the morning or later in the day to try to avoid those peak temperatures can be really useful in terms of preventing heat stress. With that, there's my contact information. If you guys have questions, I will see if I can pull the chat box up here a second. I'm going to stop sharing this. I think I need to do that to see the chat. Doesn't look like anybody has questions, Amy.
They may just be shy. So if you guys have questions for Dr. Vander Ley, as you think about what he's talked about and how you could implement them at the livestock shows you're involved in, please go ahead and type those in. While we're waiting for you guys to type, I'll go ahead and launch the survey so we can be multitasking that way. So, Dr. Vander Ley, what are some ways that you've seen that have been successful in terms of exhibitor education? Is that having project meetings where you have a veterinarian come in and talk about some of these things, or what's your thoughts on maybe some ways that would work well as far as the education goes?
I think the project meetings would work well. Unfortunately, and this has been this is one of my frustrations that I think we have a lot of opportunity to correct, is that a lot of times as a veterinarian, I don't get involved until something bad happens. There's been a few shows that I've been part of that are really proactive in terms of having a plan in place and then including parts of that in the exhibitor education. But I think there's opportunities, to interact with 4-H clubs and FFA groups to get some of that education done beforehand. And I think having people understand what the expectations are is really important. There's there's always as a veterinarian who's checked a lot of animals in, I always perceive a lot of tension when people show up at a check-in and they're wondering whether they're going to get passed or not. And I don't think it should be that hard or that intimidating. My preference would be, and these are usually my favorite interactions, is when someone says, "Yeah, we had a lamb that had a pretty good fungus spot on it. We just left it home." That's exactly what I'm after. I want them to understand what clubland fungus is. I want them to understand what sore mouth is. I want them to know what foot rot is, so that when they have an animal that comes up with foot rot or something right before a show, they just don't even take it. Shows are not places where animals should come to be sick. They shouldn't come there sick. If they get sick while they're there, ideally they would go home if that's feasible to do that. They're very stressful events, and stress doesn't help. It doesn't help people get better, and it certainly doesn't help the animal get better. So the leaving the sick animals at home is a really positive thing, and that needs to happen before, and it's based on those exhibitors understanding what disease is and what they should do when it happens. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to interact with 4-H kids and FFA students before the event happens, and I think that interaction should be based on some of the plans that a show develops in terms of biological risk management.
Well, we're waiting for folks to type in their questions. So I guess maybe to press you a little bit, what would be some examples of thinking about those interruptions of routes of transmission? So what would be some examples of things you've seen shows do? You shared a few, but what would be some examples of maybe things you would suggest a fair board implements?
So I think a lot of this becomes education as well, but some things that I've seen that are important is if there's almost never the ability to wash hands or wash things inside barns. There's wash racks that are available, but I see a lot of movement between animals that happens from people who haven't washed hands and they haven't washed equipment. So making some facilities available, and this actually has a sort of a double-edged advantage. One is if you have hand washing or wash stations available, and they don't have to be permanent fixtures. They can be. I've seen some really cool, you know, temporary sink setups that people have developed that can be put in barns so that you can wash equipment, wash hands, and also they can be very useful for the public, right? The public comes in, interacts with these animals, they get something on them. If they can wash that off, we decrease the risk of zoonotic transmission to the public, which is a great deal. I think educating exhibitors, especially younger kids, but people of all ages, that you need to be prepared for the fair. So you got to have your equipment, your feeding supplies, your buckets, your grooming equipment, things like that. And while it's great to share, it's bad to share diseases, and sharing equipment is kind of like sharing diseases. So we got to be careful about that. Most people assume that their animals are perfectly healthy and that everyone else's animals are the risky ones, and we can kind of leverage that a little bit. It's like you don't want to give what those animals have to yours, so it's better not to share that type of equipment. And if you're going to, make sure you go through the proper disinfection steps before and after you use it to make sure that you're not transferring things. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of effort put in at shows to try to manage these types of things or to educate people. Some of it's a little bit common sense, but common sense often gets thrown out in the heat of battle when, and my family and I are certainly guilty of this. Last year we showed up at the fair. It was the first time we had ever done a county fair. My kids have just reached that age, and we were a couple buckets short. And somebody's like, well, here, you can use these two. So we used someone else's buckets, and thankfully that didn't have any impacts I've been able to notice yet. But those are risky behaviors. And then things like, there's some things that fairs do really well that actually are good for biosecurity. One is that making sure bedding stays really clean, that the manure gets picked up and taken away, but making sure that the manure disposal is well outside of the area where animals are ever going to be, so that they don't get to interact with feces from other animals is important. And having a good disposal plan for that material in general is important. And then some cleanup procedures and disinfection to make sure that stuff from one year doesn't get transferred to another year just by virtue of the fact it didn't get cleaned up well. So it's kind of a holistic biosecurity plan. Doesn't have to be extraordinarily complicated. It needs to be in place that people can think about how transmission happens and how they can interrupt it.
Okay, well, thank you. I don't see any other questions. The group must be a little bit quiet this morning, but I know they took home a lot of good information. It's just something to think about, especially this time of year as we realize that it is just around the corner, these shows. So
Yep.
with that, thank you again, Dr. Vander Ley, for your presentation. Great job on that, and we thank you everyone for attending our Animal Care Wednesday webinar today. Hopefully you were able to fill out that quick survey. This session, like I mentioned earlier, was recorded, and so you'll be able to view it later if you would like to, as well as past recordings. And then also on that Animal Care Wednesday website will be the schedule for future sessions. So hope to see you next month at our next webinar. And with that, I think we're done for the day. Hopefully we'll see you all in July, and good luck with your county fairs, everyone.